Criticism has a particular kind of sting. It doesn't always arrive as an attack. Sometimes it comes wrapped in concern, sometimes in a joke that lands a little too hard, sometimes in the quiet accumulation of other people's doubts about a choice you've made, repeated often enough that you start to wonder if they might be right. I know that feeling. As an example, I decided to take a gap year between my undergraduate and graduate degrees, and many in my family had reservations. The job market was difficult, employers rarely hired for short stints, I'd likely accumulate some debt, and getting back into academic mode after working would be harder than I thought. They weren't wrong about any of it, but they also weren't entirely right. What followed was a year of joking comments about my year off, a year of second-guessing a decision I'd made deliberately, a year of absorbing other people's doubts while trying to meet my own needs. In the end, the year wasn't wasted. I found work and did fairly well under the circumstances. But that's not the point. The point is what I learned about criticism during that year, and what I wish I'd known at the beginning of it. A graceful response to criticism isn't just good manners. It's one of the most powerful skills a woman can develop. Today, I want to share a 5-step approach that changed how I receive, evaluate, and release criticism, so it can refine me without ever allowing it to define me. Welcome back to Gracefully Lori. I'm Lori. If you're new here, this channel is for women who want to live authentically, express themselves with intention, and move through the world with quiet, modern grace. Today, we're talking about something every woman encounters, and most of us were never taught how to handle well. Criticism, negative feedback, the comment that lands wrong and lingers too long. This isn't a video about being thick-skinned. It isn't about dismissing what others say or pretending it doesn't sting. It's about developing something more sophisticated than either of those things. A 5-step approach that lets you receive criticism with composure, evaluate it with clarity, respond with elegance, and release what doesn't serve you without letting it impact you. So, step 1, the intentional pause. There's a moment that happens when criticism lands, before the words have even fully registered, before you've decided how you feel about what was just said. Your body knows first, a flush of heat, a tightening in the chest, the overwhelming urge to respond, to defend, to explain, to push back. That moment is the most dangerous one. Not because criticism is dangerous, but because what you do before you've had time to think clearly often determines everything that follows. The first step isn't about what you say. It's about what you don't say when you're genuinely reeling, when something has landed harder than expected. A single beat isn't always enough. This is where elegant practicality comes in. Reach for your glass of water. Take a slow sip. Pick up a pen. These aren't stalling tactics, they're intelligent ones. They give your nervous system a moment to settle and your response a chance to come from composure rather than reaction. And sometimes the most graceful response is simple honesty. That's an interesting point. I want to give it the consideration it deserves, so can I come back to you with my thoughts later? That's not avoidance, that's wisdom. One more thing worth remembering, and perhaps the most important thing in this moment. Focus on the message, not the messenger. The same truth can arrive wrapped in clumsy language, poor timing, or a tone that feels more like an attack than an observation. If you allow how something was said to determine whether you hear it at all, you may miss something genuinely valuable, delivered badly by someone who cared enough to say it anyway. So the pause creates enough space to separate the delivery from the content, because what she does with the content, once she's had the chance to think clearly, is where the real work begins. Step 2, be a detective, not a defender. The instinct is immediate and entirely human. Someone says something critical and the mind goes straight to one place. Why they're wrong, why they don't understand, why you need to explain yourself. Defense is the default. It feels like strength, like holding your ground, but defense has a cost. When you're defending, you're not listening, and sometimes that information contains something worth having. The shift from defender to detective changes everything. A detective doesn't arrive with a conclusion already formed. She arrives with questions and follows the thread wherever it leads. When criticism arrives, 3 questions matter most. Who is saying this and why? The source matters not to dismiss what's being said, but to understand the lens through which it's being offered. Is there a kernel of truth here? Not whether the entire comment is accurate, it rarely is, but whether somewhere inside it there's something that reflects a reality worth acknowledging. During my gap year, the joking comments about my year off stung, partly because they were unkind and partly because underneath them was a legitimate concern I'd already wrestled with myself. Acknowledging that kernel didn't mean accepting their conclusion. It meant being honest enough with myself to separate what was true from what wasn't. What is this criticism actually about? Sometimes feedback that sounds personal is really about a misunderstanding or an unmet expectation. Asking what it's actually about often reveals something more useful than the original word suggested. This isn't about being generous to people who don't deserve it. It's about being rigorous enough to extract what's genuinely useful, because the most valuable feedback she ever receives may not arrive in the most comfortable package. The detective finds what's true. The next step decides what to do with it. So, step 3, respond with elegant simplicity. Here's what most women do when criticism lands. They over-explain, they justify, they apologize for offending someone with their thoughts or words. They say far more than the moment required. The response to criticism doesn't need to be elaborate. It needs to be elegant. The goal isn't to win an argument, it's to close the conversation with clarity and poise intact, and in a way that leaves the critic with nowhere to go. Most people expect one of two responses: crumbling, the apology, the visible wound, or fighting back, the defense and the escalation. A graceful response is neither, and that's precisely why it works. When the feedback doesn't land as fair or accurate, a simple acknowledgement closes the door without agreeing to walk through it. Thanks for sharing your perspective. I appreciate you taking the time to give me that feedback. These validate that the other person spoke without validating what they said. They end the exchange cleanly, without argument, without giving the critic anything to push against. For comments that are simply rude, the approach is even simpler. That's an interesting take, said calmly, followed immediately by a change of subject. And when the feedback genuinely resonates, that's a really helpful point. I'll definitely think about how I can use that. What all three responses share is this: she doesn't apologize for existing. She doesn't justify her choices to people who haven't earned that conversation. She doesn't let the size of someone else's opinion determine the size of her response. A simple, gracious acknowledgement is the real power move. Not because it's polite, because it signals something the critic can't argue with, that she's in full control of her emotions and that her self-worth is not up for debate. Step 4, find the value and discard the rest. Most women do one of two things with criticism. They absorb it whole, giving it weight longer than it deserves, or they dismiss it entirely, deciding the critic wasn't worth listening to. A graceful woman does neither. She sifts. Think of it like panning for gold. The sediment is there, the emotion, the poor delivery, the parts that were unfair or untrue. She doesn't have to keep any of that, but somewhere beneath it, there may be something worth finding. She goes back to the kernel of the truth from step 2 and asks a more precise question. Not, is this criticism valid, but what specifically is true here and what can I do with it? A colleague mentions that a report was confusing. Underneath the sting is actionable information. Something in the structure didn't land the way she intended. She can ask which section felt unclear and make one specific adjustment next time. A friend observes that she sometimes comes across as too direct. Perhaps there are specific contexts where softening the delivery would serve her better. That's a refinement, a small adjustment that makes her more effective, not less herself. Criticism isn't a verdict, it's a data point. She picks one specific thing, makes one deliberate adjustment, watches what happens. This is how graceful women use criticism rather than simply survive it. Not by letting it define who they are, by letting it refine who they're becoming. The brain has done its work, now the heart has something to say. So, step 5, release what needs to be released. After that useful kernel has been extracted, after she's decided to keep and what to discard, there's always something remaining. The harsh tone, the unfair judgment, the shame that arrived uninvited, the anger still looking for somewhere to go. This is the work of the heart, and it may be the most important step of all. A graceful woman consciously releases what remains. not because the hurt wasn't real. It was. But because her energy is too precious to spend on negativity she's already decided isn't useful. A simple mental exercise. Imagine everything that remains. The harsh words, the unfair judgment, the sting that has already served its purpose, and placing it deliberately into a box. Close the lid, set it aside, consciously choose not to return to it. The act of consciously releasing, rather than passively waiting to feel better, puts her back in control of her own emotional experience. It's also worth remembering this. Harsh criticism says considerably more about the person delivering it than the person receiving it. Cruelty in criticism is rarely about truth. It's about the critic's own frustration or insecurity. A graceful woman refuses to internalize something that was never really about her. And then she does something most women forget to do. She gives herself permission to be proud. Proud of how she listened when she wanted to shut down. Proud of how she investigated when she wanted to defend. Proud of how she responded when she wanted to react. Finally, she returns to the truth. Her self-worth is not contextual. It does not rise with praise and fall with criticism. Criticism is useful. Neither one determines her value. What just happened was an external event, not an internal crisis. She walks forward, not diminished, not defensive, not carrying weight that was never hers to carry, but something more than she was before it arrived. Criticism doesn't define her, it refines her. Criticism or negative feedback will always happen. In the voice of someone who loves you and is worried, in the joke that lands harder than intended, in the professional feedback that stings before it helps, and the comment that was simply unkind. It will always happen, and it will always carry a sting. But a woman who has developed this 5-step approach doesn't face criticism the way she once did. She pauses before she reacts. She investigates before she defends. She responds with elegant simplicity. She finds what's valuable and discards the rest. And she releases what doesn't serve her. 5 steps. Criticism and feedback are not the enemy of a graceful woman. They are part of how she becomes one. Not because they define her, because she uses them to refine her. So, which of these 5 steps feels most natural to you, and which one are you most ready now to develop? Please let me know in the comments. And if this video resonated with you, please like it. It helps others find this content that might be meaningful for them too. And if you're interested in more conversations about graceful living, please consider subscribing. Until next time, my graceful friends.